I don't know if you've noticed, but news media has gone under a lot of changes over the last decade, and even more changes over the last 4 years. And as media companies become more unstable, the Canadian government is spending a lot more money to try and give them some stability again. It's almost as if the government has a vested interest in the media landscape staying the way it is. Time for a deep dive. People have been making media reports about current events ever since there's been written word. We love it. There are hieroglyphics about sports scores and weather reports and opinions about the pharaoh. Probably. Coverage of current events has been a staple of human existence in every era and every location and every culture ever since, well, always. It's something we practically have to do. We can't help ourselves. As long as there are people who want to read about whatever's happening, people will write about it. And as long as something's happening and someone is writing about it, people will read it. It's a collective compulsion that sent us down a death spiral that eventually brought us tabloid magazines and Tosh.0. Newspapers were the first industrial businesses built around our thirst for news coverage. Even after broadcast news showed up on TV and radio, newspapers were the only kind of news media that was on demand. Big newspapers in urban centers sometimes put out 2 editions a day and had circulations in the millions. Producing, editing, and circulating the paper every day took the full-time effort of thousands of people. Everyone read the paper. Subscribers paid money to have the paper delivered to their homes every day, often including both daily papers. And if it was late or got wet, boy, did the delivery boy ever hear about it. And you know what? I used to be a paper boy for the Whippy Free Press. It would screw up my Wednesdays when I was 10 years old. I'd get home and I would have to go distribute 150 papers to various homes. They'd have me collate the flyers into the newspaper and I'd make $4.40. But you know what? I was a part of that distribution network on how people used to get news. Every kind of serious industrial investor wanted to be in the newspaper business. It was a sure thing, practically recession-proof. The subscription revenue was just the start. Anyone who wanted to advertise anything practically had to buy an ad in a newspaper. That included local businesses like car dealerships and real estate developers, and big national brands who needed consumer awareness to sell soap or nylons or beer or whatever. Even individuals who wanted to sell a car or small businesses who wanted to hire someone to do a job had to buy a classified ad. Lots of newspaper publishers were happy to just put out a decent paper and put all that subscriber and ad revenue on the bottom line with a nice fat shareholder dividend. But the papers who cared to outwork their competition often hired the best talent and tried for the best coverage. Or they just hired more talent and made a fatter paper.
Right here.
How much time to make the late final?
Chief.
Hiya, Chief. Just the person I want to apologize to.
About 7 minutes.
There was no real reason not to carry a big staff. On slow news days, they might have to go cover the mayor's daughter's piano recital or whatever. But when something big happened, a newspaper's coverage was as good as the depth of its staff. Papers were more popular when they ran good coverage with lots of photos, all sorts of different angles, and different interviews. They could run different opinion columns to get people mad in different ways, whatever kept them reading. And they always kept reading. They'd complain, call the paper a birdcage liner, call the writers hacks, but they kept reading. There was nothing else to read. Pro newsrooms refined the art of print journalism during the era that the newspaper business was competitive. At that time, newspaper barons were trying to outdo each other. But nobody ever got rich working in the newsroom and actually producing or editing news. The money, as always, is in owning the means of production. And advertisers weren't actually that interested in the news the paper put out. They were more interested in the newspaper's ability to produce 1 million copies every day and deliver them to those people who were paying to actually read the news. It wasn't the news itself that made the money. The core asset was the distribution network that got it out. Apple doesn't exactly sell iPhones so much as they sell devices that allow people to access the apps in the Apple Store. Spotify pays Joe Rogan all that money because that way anyone that listens to Joe Rogan has to subscribe to Spotify. When the internet first became a part of people's daily lives, it didn't change the newspaper business much at all. Publishers were in no hurry to put out digital editions that people probably weren't going to pay for. Besides, if it caught on, that would be the end of their distribution networks. It wasn't exactly that they were worried about the competition, they just didn't think it was possible. In 2007, the Financial Post couldn't imagine that they might lose readers to some guy in a basement in Ajax who puts out a stock market rag that anyone can get. It's on the internet. They just didn't think it could happen. But it did happen. and it happened quickly. New mediums like blogging and podcasting emerged, and that forced the papers to carry more of their news digitally. But they still had newsrooms that could outwork any blog, and the content that those newsrooms produced was still an important part of civil discourse, especially when there was an election coming up and the campaigns that might become governments needed somewhere to spend their advertising money. The revenue side of the business took a big hit when sites like Craigslist ended their ability to sell classified ads. And bigger advertisers were starting to spend money on digital ads, but they were still buying plenty of print ads because people were still reading the paper. Until
sears their eyeballs. They now can't see what's headed their way, but they can feel it.
Overnight, the daily paper wasn't important anymore. The dopamine hit that comes from reading about things that happened yesterday is nothing compared to the one that comes from reading about things happening now, to people you know. The dominant news medium wasn't newspapers anymore. It wasn't even the internet. It was social media itself, especially Facebook, that went public booking more revenue than any newspaper publisher had ever seen, and just kept growing it. By then, Canadian print media was dominated by two big companies, Post Media and Torstar, and Facebook didn't put as big a hole in their business as you might think. Post Media earns its revenue from advertising, circulation, and digital media. From that, we have to deduct the cost of production and distribution, materials. There's some standard finance charges here, but even after this highly suspicious other expenses line, Post Media's operations made money until last year. But when we add up the non-operating expenses, they're getting shelled on the bottom line. Most of that is impairment and restructuring charges on the assets that used to represent control of the dominant information medium. So they're losing money, but they're losing it on their own mistakes. It's the same story over at Torstar. Declining revenue, but plenty of money left over after they put out the paper. They too are contending with a big, scary other expenses line. Much of it representing write-downs on papers they haven't owned for that long. See, when the internet started to put a dent in subscribership, the big newspaper companies jumped on the chance to buy networks of small papers for cheap. But apparently not cheap enough. Both companies started closing down newsrooms all over the country. They closed more and more every year until, in 2017, Torstar and Post Media bought a bunch of papers off of each other and immediately closed them. I guess it probably had something to do with avoiding severance costs or making the write-down smaller or something, but could you imagine how it played out in those offices? They're buying us out? That's great! They wouldn't buy us out just to close us down. Oh. According to the local news research project, from 2008 through today, newspaper mergers have closed a net total of 260 newspapers across Canada. People were still reading the stories produced by the newsrooms that hadn't been shuttered, mostly when they were shared on Facebook. But the newspapers needed Facebook, and not the other way around. If users weren't reading and sharing the news outlet's stories, they'd be reading and sharing something else. The company still generated enough cash to afford the staffs that kept the content coming and kept the papers relevant. They just didn't want to pay for their own staff, and they didn't have to.
Technology is driving distribution, and the internet is a free source of news and opinions. Seeking a balance in this new world, we're now faced with hardship.
Not if they could make the government pay for them. Between the digital media tax credit, the Canadian journalism tax credit, and COVID-19 subsidies, the government pretty much paid for Post Media's impairment and restructuring expenses. Torstar was taken private in 2020, so we don't even know how much pandemic loot it got, but through 2019, government handout revenue amounted to about as much as the cost of operating the papers. The government also bought an unknown amount of millions of dollars worth of ads related to COVID public health orders to help the paper's top lines. If the news companies are too cheap to pay for their own reporting staff, someone is going to have to keep them going. And it might as well be the government. But if the government was just doing it to keep the news coming, they wouldn't be going out of their way to make sure the money only goes to companies that can afford to carry full-time staff. The Canadian journalism tax credit is only available to qualified journalism organizations who carry a minimum number of full and part-time employees. Small companies that use freelancers to produce news content, like The Deep Dive, aren't qualified journalism organizations, so they get nothing. In many cases, these smaller companies are the ones creating the content that people are the most interested in. The podcast medium has exploded since 2016, mostly through indie producers that aren't eligible for any government money because they don't have the capital to keep a staff. The big media companies all got into this podcast business right around the time that the government money started to show up. News companies' podcasts sucked at first. Well, they mostly still suck, but they got a lot better once they started using that government money to hire talent away from indie producers. In the hyper-consolidated news business landscape of 2022, the big papers being allowed to fail would make space for smaller creators to step up and take their share of the available ad revenue. And so would funding small creators the way they fund big ones. But the government can't have that, especially not around election time. Campaigns, of course, wouldn't know who to buy ads from.
What?
After 5 years spending millions to keep these dinosaurs alive while they close newspapers, it's obvious that the government isn't propping up the papers to save jobs or even save newsrooms. They're most interested in keeping news production centralized in a couple of companies where they can control it. But they can't keep doing it forever. The government needs for these newspapers to get a new source of revenue, but it had to be a source that meant that they didn't have to give up control. Enter Bill C-18, which will create Canada's Online News Act. It will mandate that Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. have to pay Canadian news organizations for the news content that they generate when it's shared on social media or arrived at through search. It isn't yet clear how it's going to be applied, and how the government is going to keep Google and Facebook from just de-indexing content they have to pay for, but it's been clear from the start that the payments are only going to be payable to qualified journalism organizations, including the layoff-happy newspapers presently being held together by government labor rebates. Nobody gets into the news writing business to get rich, not even financial news. The deep dive is here because we think finance and markets can be covered in a better and more interesting way. We'd be thrilled if Google or Facebook paid some of our staffing costs. Hell, we'd be happy to take money from the Canadian government. And we don't even have any write-downs to cover either. We'd use it to produce more content. Our stuff is every bit as good as anything those welfare queens over at the Financial Post ever come up with. I'd sure like to find out, but the government doesn't. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. If you could do me a big favor, please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Let us know what you think in the comments section. I love you all.